Welcome to this lecture on ancient Egyptian foodways with some anthropological thoughts about food and its importance in human culture. We're going to be taking a look at food not from an economic point of view, which is what we've talked about before, particularly with bread and beer and agriculture, pastoralism, but instead the culture of food, the way food is made, the way it is shared, the way it is presented, the way it fills in parts of our lives in terms of ritual. So get ready for Lecture 18. Whet your appetites, because here we go. Food can be nutrition for most people. You just eat because you need to eat. But in our own lives, we have all kinds of associations with food that make food very important for us. So the idea of a comfort food, ideas about food for holidays, food shared with friends. We have fast food, and there's an entire culture associated with that. So it does make sense to us that food can be something for humans beyond just the nutritional aspect of food, though the nutritional aspect is important too. If you think about dieting and the various ways that we approach, maintaining our weight and achieving weight loss, there's an entire culture associated with food there as well. So keep in mind, this is just a list of some ways that we can think about food other than just the actual nutrition that is needed. Food can have an aesthetic aspect to it. We don't know much about this for the ancient Egyptians, but we know in plenty of cultures how food is presented, how it is plated, can be an important part of the way people appreciate and enjoy food. So if you go to an expensive restaurant and you can see how the plating makes the food into a little bit of a work of art, depending on what the chef thinks should be done with it. We know food can obviously be associated with religion, so worship and rituals, from having, say, challah, in Jewish culture, to eating certain kinds of food at Thanksgiving or Christmas, as a part of like a religious meal that you might have. It doesn't have to be religious, obviously, because plenty of people eat those meals at those holidays without any religious ties to them. But the food that you do have can have religious associations, even if you don't associate it with a particular religion when you eat it today. Its history could be tied to religion. Food can also be part of our sense of building community, the way in which we share meals together, the way in which we come together around food. Food becomes a way of bonding people, of sharing something perhaps that you've made, of enjoying someone's company through the presence of food, the shared experience of eating together. Food can be political. Food can be a symbol of power. There can be politics involved in food. In the United States, famously, um, the U.S. food guide pyramid, which tells us what we should be eating, was politicized in its creation, and that politicization pushed certain foods to the top of the categories to be eaten over other foods. Famously, too, in America, you may or may not know the story of the people who made a giant wheel of cheese to deliver to President Thomas Jefferson, to show the work of their hands as ordinary Americans and appreciating him. So he's the big cheese as president. So food can be connected to power, and what you eat can be a political statement. For example, consider veganism and the politics associated with that. So food doesn't have to just be something in private, in the home that you enjoy. It can be a very political, very public um, symbol as well. Obviously, food is economic, and we did touch on this when we talked about economies in the last unit. So there's issues of supply, the supply of the food, the demand. How is that food grown? How is labor managed in order to make and prepare that food? Who does the work? In other words, then there's of course trade, and then the intercultural intersection of food as people come together from different cultures through trade and go, oh, that looks good. I'd like to try that. Oh, that looks yummy. A great example for that would be Italian migrants in the United States in the 19th and early 20th centuries, adapting to what's available in American markets and changing recipes to suit, what was available here. So Italian American cooking in the United States, it doesn't look like Italian cooking necessarily in Italy. And Italy has lots of regional variations of cooking. But the meeting of those two cultures essentially creates another cuisine. You could say the same about Tex-Mex cooking culture as people come together and enjoy each other's foodways. Food can be a marker of class and status. So if I'm eating filet mignon, that tells people, oh, he's got the money to buy this very expensive cut of meat, this very nicely, wonderfully prepared cut of meat. And of course, asking for that meat to be prepared in a certain way might betray what class you belong to. Um, so if you are asking for well done for a very fine piece of beef, probably people will judge you for that. Since the upper class food culture is to eat that medium rare or rare. The association is that medium rare and rare is the better way to do it, the tastier way to do it. So you can even inflect judgments on people's identity in terms of what class, social class they belong to by the way that they eat their food, by the way that they ask for their food to be prepared, by what foods they even eat. I'll never forget in high school having to take a class in learning where all of the forks and spoons go and the knives go in a formal place setting, in case I was ever part of a dinner where it was formal and I needed to know which fork to eat my salad with, and which spoon was for which soup. So if you've ever looked at those kinds of rituals involved with place settings, you understand very clearly how food can be a marker of your status. And does he know? Is he aware of the rules? And last but certainly not least, there are lots of other things we could talk about. Food can be medicinal. So consuming foods can have different medical implications around the world. You know, in the New Testament, for example, it says, "Take a little wine for thy stomach's sake," as a treatment of maybe an upset stomach or a little bit of digestion problems. Foods in different cultures are associated with making you feel better. Even today, my mom swears by eating garlic for her health and making my dad eat garlic, which I'm not opposed to because I love garlic. Um, but I don't exactly know how much health benefit they're getting by putting all their stock in garlic. So very much food can have not just a flat out we need it to live by um, power to it, but it can also be something that might be associated with saving your life or improving your health. Here is a scene of a bakery from the tomb of Ramses III. So this is much later in Egyptian history than we've talked about so far. And you can see here they're making the conical bread. They produce bread in shapes as well, bread being baked and cooked, bread as part of the sort of basic necessity of life. The ubiquity of bread is so important in ancient Egypt. That the word for offering has a loaf of bread on the table, hetep, as we talked about in one of the previous lectures. Here is a picture of someone drinking beer. This is from the 18th dynasty. This is not an Egyptian, it's a Syrian mercenary. You can tell by his hair and beard. And he's got a straw, rather interesting straw, drinking beer. We think that the straw was necessary because Egyptian beer was a little bit cloudy and may have had bits of barley cake in it. And so you didn't want to get those little bits up into your mouth. It wouldn't be exactly like eating a wet donut or something. One of the foods that we're going to try today is a bread made from these little critters. These are called tiger nuts or earth almonds. It's actually a weed in the United States that people try to, get out of their yards so you can spray for this weed. It's called yellow nutsedge. Ground, these earth almonds produce a sort of nutty flour that is part of one of the breads that I baked for today. I baked a tiger nut date loaf that we will try. So keep in mind, as we think about foods around the world, the various kinds of ingredients that people have access to. And I always think about what made someone, take that and decide they wanted to eat it. You have to dig these out of the ground. They're attached to the roots. And so, what was somebody just digging in the ground and pulled this up and went, oh, I think I'll try that. Um, Sometimes that's a good way to get yourself killed. If you ever talk to mushroom foragers, identifying the right mushroom to eat, can be sometimes a matter of being really sick versus having a really good time. Foods that were available in ancient Egypt did include grains. Most common would be barley and emmer wheat. I did make a barley loaf for us to try, and I made it with the Egyptian barley beer that I made. So try to give it a little bit of flavor to it, because there aren't many flavorants that you can have in baking bread. When we bake bread, we can add sugar, we can add a fat to it like butter. And the Egyptians apparently did not do that. They do have fats they can use, like rendered bird fat and beef fat, for example. But it's not really clear that they add fats to their breads. So it does produce a different kind of bread than perhaps you might be used to. We'll see when you try it today. They have wine, most likely red wine only. I don't know that there's a lot of evidence for anything other than a red. They have vegetables, and this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the most commonly seen vegetables, particularly in tomb paintings, things like onions. You do see bunches of onions as offerings, garlic, lettuce, different kinds of beans, lentils, and chickpeas. We know fruits included things like melons, figs, and dates. Hence, I used dates in one of the breads that I made for you guys. Meat, lots and lots of meats. So oxen, sheep, goats, pigs, cattle, ducks, geese, and a wide variety of things. There's some evidence even mice, for example, there are recipes that involve cooking them. And then spices. This is another way you can think anthropologically about food. because people could eat all these things, but how they flavor them does matter, and that can tell you a lot about a culture. Um, so honey was available. The Egyptians did keep bees, salts, various spices like coriander and fennel. And there's some others that I didn't put in. So you weren't going to be seeing things like cinnamon and pepper in ancient Egypt. It's not available. So the flavors that you would get um, could be quite different from what we would expect in the Western culture for flavors. So I could have made the beer that I made with a little bit of coriander or perhaps even fennel in it, which would have given it quite a different flavor. Part of the tradition of foodways is how people enjoy the food in communal settings. So you can eat food in the family room, just everybody grab a bowl and eat. But you can also eat communally to celebrate, to have fun, to have a good time. We know the Egyptians did this because we see on tomb paintings examples of their feasts. We know that banquets started in the middle of the day, in the afternoon. Um, must have been pretty hot. We don't have a word for to banquet, to go out and party. We do know that Hebi means to celebrate. So perhaps they just told people I'm going out celebrating. Irher unefer means to have a vacation. Possibly that might have been used to refer to this banqueting. We know the Egyptians had festivals, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the section on religion. And festivals celebrating the gods were large communal occasions to eat and get way drunk and have a good time, as you're going to find out. But we just don't have a word necessarily for feasting in particular, banqueting in particular. We know that unless you were married, men and women were separated, and we know that people sat by their social class, their status. So the very highest socially sat on chairs, and the very lowest sat on the floor and further away from the host, which would strike us today, I think, as really off-putting to seat people by status. But that's not uncommon around the world culturally to look at people and go, your status is X, you will sit further away. Instead, you think about, for example, parties for us, we might seat people according to who we think could get along, who might have interesting conversation partners with each other. Who do we want to, have meet that we think maybe the two of them, you could play a little bit of matchmaker. Um, Maybe formal political banquets might be seeded by status. So if, say, the president were throwing a banquet and wanted to honor his highest donor with closer proximity to him, that would probably be more likely where you would see status and class included in banqueting. But I think for a lot of us, that just feels very strange to see a party, a communal event in class terms. But then again, maybe not. Maybe you only invite certain classes of people to your parties to begin with. It's worth thinking about. That we know also too that the ancient Egyptians did entertain their guests at these banquets, not just with good food, but by professional dancers, always women, always incredibly scantily clad, if not flat out naked, as well as musicians. And we see plenty of tomb paintings showing the women playing Egyptian instruments, which we might touch a little bit on later, instruments in terms of religion, but we're not going to address music quite a bit. We just don't know exactly how Egyptian music sounded. We don't know anything about their melodies or, the tunes that they played. Might be an area of research for you guys if you're interested. We see in plenty of the scenes of banqueters. Here are these entertainment women. She's playing a double flute, double reeded instrument here. Um, I love her face and her hands together. She's just like, mm-hmm. um, This is also interesting because you can kind of see it, but very hard to see. On very top of her head, there appears to be some kind of cone. And for the longest time, Egyptologists thought that this was like a perfumed fat that sat on the head and melted and, made people smell good during the banquet scene. Um, but we found in Amarna, a town in Egypt, a few years ago, a burial with one of these cones, or at least what we think is one of these cones. And the archaeologists who looked at that burial noted that it was a hollow shell with fabric around it, held together with beeswax. And it might be that it was actually a fertility object, that it might have represented something rather than just merely like, let's keep us smelling good. So debate will, of course, still rage because it's hard to make any judgments based on one finding from one tomb. That might not tell us anything about the thousands of years of Egyptian history. So we'll see what happens. Here are some scenes, various tomb paintings of scenes from banquets. You can see the scantily clothed dancing girls, people feeding each other, people seated near the person of honor, piles and piles of the food. Um, so very clearly the Egyptians did enjoy having a good time in a world that did not just see food as nutrition, but also as a form of communal joy. That has been it for our look at Egyptian foodways. Stay tuned for more on the Egyptian family coming soon.